It was a gray morning in a quiet corner of Portland. The streets were still damp from last night's rain, and the city was only just beginning to wake up. Through the mist, an old man slowly made his way down the narrow street, his coat buttoned up to the neck, his shoes worn, and his steps heavy yet steady. His name was Edward Hale. In his trembling hand, he carried an old pocket watch, its silver casing dull and scratched with time. He looked at it often, as though the watch were not just a timepiece, but a companion, a piece of something or someone long gone. Edward stopped in front of a small café, the Willow Cup. Its windows were fogged, but inside he could see the warm glow of yellow lights and the silhouettes of a few early customers. A faint aroma of roasted coffee beans and baked bread drifted out each time the door opened. He took a deep breath and pushed the door. A soft bell rang above his head. Inside, warmth wrapped around him. Conversations murmured in the background, the hum of the espresso machine, the scraping of chairs, the faint tune of an old radio playing something from the 70s. But as Edward entered, the voices dimmed just slightly. The kind of quiet that happens when strangers notice someone who doesn't seem to belong. The cafe owner, Claire, a woman in her 40s, looked up from behind the counter. Her face was pale, her apron stained with coffee splashes. She didn't smile. Edward shuffled toward the counter, placing a few coins, barely enough for a cup, on the surface. His voice trembled. "Just the cheapest sandwich, please." Claire's brow furrowed. She glanced at the coins, then at him, his shabby coat, his trembling fingers, the old watch glinting faintly under the cafe lights. Her lips tightened. "That's not enough for a sandwich, sir. Maybe a small black coffee." Edward nodded slowly, his eyes falling. "Coffee will do." As he waited, a whisper moved through the cafe, quiet but sharp. "Poor old man," someone muttered. "Probably homeless," another voice added. Edward heard them. Each word landed like a small stone in his chest. He kept his eyes on the floor, clutching his hat in both hands. When Claire finally placed the small cup before him, she did it with a sigh, sliding it across the counter. "Here you go." "Thank you," Edward said softly. He tried to smile, but she had already turned away. He took his cup to the farthest table by the window. The glass was cold to the touch, and through it he could see people passing by, rushing, talking, living. He took a slow sip, the bitterness grounding him. Then his gaze fell on the watch again. He pressed the small button at its top. It clicked open, revealing an old photograph inside, a young man with a bright smile, his son. Edward whispered under his breath, "You'd have loved this place, Michael." For a moment, his eyes closed and his hand trembled slightly. Across the cafe, a woman noticed him, Isabella Ward, though most knew her as Izzy, the owner of the small boutique next door. She was young, perhaps in her early 30s, graceful, but with the seriousness in her eyes that came from loss of her own. She'd seen Edward before, passing by her shop window, always alone. Something about the old man and his quiet dignity struck her each time. That morning, as she watched him take tiny sips from his cup, she noticed the way Claire looked at him, the way others whispered. Something inside her stirred, not pity, but a deep ache, like recognition. After a moment, she stood up, walked to the counter, and said gently, "Claire, could you please make a sandwich? Add it to my bill." Claire looked confused. "For you?" "No," Isabella said, glancing toward Edward. "For him." The cafe grew a little quieter. Claire hesitated, then shrugged. "Your money." When the sandwich was ready, Isabella walked over to Edward's table. She placed the plate in front of him, without saying much, just a small, kind smile. Edward looked up, startled. "I didn't order this." "I know," Isabella replied softly. "You looked like you could use it." He tried to protest, but his empty stomach betrayed him. He whispered, "Thank you, miss, but I can't repay you." "You don't have to. Just eat while it's warm." Edward's eyes glistened. He picked up the sandwich slowly, his fingers trembling. He ate in small bites, almost reverently, as though every crumb reminded him of something he'd lost long ago. From the counter, Claire watched silently, her expression unreadable. Some customers pretended not to see. Others stared, curious, whispering. But Isabella stayed there, quietly sitting across from Edward, her hands folded, watching him, not with pity, but with understanding. Outside, the rain had stopped. A thin beam of sunlight broke through the clouds and touched the cafe window, glinting off the silver of Edward's pocket watch.
The afternoon light drifted through the cafe window, painting soft gold across the wooden tables. The room had grown quieter, though the faint hiss of the espresso machine still filled the background. Edward had finished his sandwich and was now staring down at the pocket watch in his hand. The silver cover caught the sunlight, and for a moment the reflection shimmered across the table like a tiny spark of life. Isabella watched him quietly. Something about that old watch felt important. She could sense the weight of a story inside it, a story untold, locked within the tired eyes of the man before her. Finally, she asked softly, "That watch, it seems special. Was it a gift?" Edward didn't answer right away. His fingers brushed across the surface of the watch, gentle, almost hesitant. When he spoke, his voice was low, careful, like every word carried years of memory. "It belonged to my son, Michael." Isabella felt a pang in her chest. She remembered the photograph inside, the smiling young man. "He looks kind," she said. Edward nodded, eyes distant. He was. He had this way of making everyone feel seen. This watch was his graduation gift. Said it would remind him to never waste a second doing something meaningless. He chuckled weakly, a hollow sound. Funny how life doesn't always give you the time you think you have. A long silence followed. Isabella didn't press. She just listened. Edward went on, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the cafe walls. "Michael joined the Marines right after college. Said he wanted to serve, to make a difference. I was proud and terrified. I used to wait by the phone every night, praying I wouldn't get the call no parent should get." His voice broke slightly. "But one evening, I did. The cafe around them seemed to fade. Even the sound of cups clinking felt distant. He never came home," Edward whispered. "They sent his watch back to me in a small box. Just this watch, and a folded flag." Isabella felt her throat tighten. The pain in Edward's words wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, like rain that never stops. She said gently, "I'm so sorry." Edward nodded, blinking back tears. "I lost my wife a few years after that. The grief, it took everything. The house, the friends, the purpose. I've been living with ghosts ever since." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside continued, people passing by, cars rolling through puddles, but at that table, Time seemed to stand still. Then Isabella asked softly, "Why come here, to this cafe?" Edward looked down at his cup, now empty. "Because it's close to where he used to live, and every morning I tell myself maybe I'll feel closer to him if I sit where he might have once sat." Isabella's eyes welled up. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. After a long pause, she whispered, "My father used to say something like that. He believed that some places remember people, even after they're gone." Edward smiled faintly. Maybe that's true.
There was something in Isabella's expression, a mix of empathy and something else, something unspoken. After a few moments, Edward looked at her and asked, "You own the boutique next door, don't you?" "Yes," she said, surprised. "How did you know?" He chuckled softly. "I see you open it every morning when I walk by. My wife used to own a small shop too. She made dresses by hand. You reminded me of her the first time I saw you." Isabella smiled, a small, heartfelt smile. "Then I'm honored." Edward looked down at the watch again. "This thing, it's all I have left. Sometimes I think it's the only reason I keep going. I keep winding it every morning, even though it's stopped working." She looked at him gently. "Maybe it's not supposed to tell time anymore. Maybe it's supposed to remind you that you still have time." For the first time, Edward didn't look away. His tired eyes softened, and his voice trembled when he said, "You sound like him." Isabella reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his. "Maybe your son isn't as far as you think." A tear slid down Edward's cheek, though he smiled through it. "Thank you," he whispered. "You have no idea what that means." The cafe's door opened just then, letting in a rush of cold air. Claire glanced toward the door, then back at them, her earlier coldness replaced with something quieter, maybe regret. Isabella stood. "Come with me," she said softly. Edward frowned. "Where?" "To my shop. You can rest there for a while." He hesitated, but followed. The two stepped out into the fading afternoon light, leaving the cafe behind, and with it, the whispers. Outside, the city had begun to glow in the golden hour. Isabella led Edward into her boutique, a cozy space filled with warm light and soft fabrics, smelling faintly of lavender and old wood. Edward looked around, his eyes wide. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "It's not much, but it's home." He smiled faintly. Home. That's a word I haven't used in a long time. As he sat on a small chair near the window, the watch still in his hand, Isabella went to make tea. She paused at the counter, watching him from afar. The way his eyes softened as he looked at the photographs on the walls, the quiet gentleness in his posture. Something about him felt familiar. And then, as she turned to pour the tea, she noticed something, a framed photograph on her shelf. It was old and slightly faded. In it was her late fiancé, Daniel, the man she'd lost years ago. He was smiling, holding a cup of coffee in the very same cafe next door, and hanging from his wrist was the same silver pocket watch. The teapot whistled softly in the background. Isabella stood motionless for a moment, staring at the photograph, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the glass. Daniel. The name echoed in her chest like an old song she hadn't heard in years. Her breath caught. The same cafe, the same smile, and that watch, unmistakable, even after all these years. She turned, her heart pounding gently beneath her ribs, and looked at Edward. He was sitting quietly by the window, his weathered hands folded around the very same watch. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, time folding in on itself. She
She walked toward him slowly, setting the cups down on the small table between them. "Edward," she said carefully, "you said this watch belonged to your son, Michael, right?" He nodded, eyes soft. "Yes, Michael Edwards. Why?" Her lips parted slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did he ever know someone named Daniel?" Edward looked surprised, frowning as if searching his memory. "Daniel? Yes, I think so. They trained together, if I'm not mistaken. Why do you ask?" Isabella swallowed hard. Her eyes went to the photograph again, then back to him. "Because Daniel was the man I loved." For a moment, silence fell, deep and heavy. The air between them felt alive with something unseen, something both painful and sacred. Edward's face changed slowly. You were his fiancée?" She nodded, tears beginning to fill her eyes. "He never came home either. They said he died during a mission. Her voice broke. "I waited for years, hoping there was some mistake, but he never came back." Edward's shoulders sagged, the truth dawning on him like a soft, sorrowful sunrise. "Then that means they were together, Michael and Daniel. My son must have been there when he trailed off, unable to finish." Isabella sat across from him, clutching her hands together, her eyes glistening. "Maybe that's why your son's watch ended up with Daniel, and then somehow found its way back to you. Maybe it was meant to bring us both here. Today." Edward closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation sinking in. The memories, the grief, the unanswered questions all converged into a single, fragile thread connecting them across years of pain. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet but calm. "Maybe this is what forgiveness looks like," he said softly. "Not forgetting, not pretending it didn't hurt, just finding peace in what remains." Isabella nodded slowly. "I think so." The two sat there for a long time, the silence between them no longer heavy, but healing, like the hush after a storm. Outside, the sun began to set, casting the room in a warm amber glow. The boutique, once just a place of work, now felt like something else, a bridge between the past and the present. After a few moments, Isabella spoke again. "Edward, would you like to see something?" She walked over to a small chest near the counter and opened it gently. Inside were letters, old, yellowed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. These were Daniel's. He wrote them during his service. I could never bring myself to open them all.
Edward looked down at the stack, his fingers trembling. "Would you like me to read one with you?" She nodded, and together they unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was strong, deliberate. Daniel's voice seemed to return with every word. "If you're reading this, I hope the world has been kind to you. I met a man today, Michael. He reminds me of what's good in people. He talks about his father a lot, says you taught him to fix watches. He told me time isn't something you control. It's something you honor. If anything ever happens to me, tell him his words mattered." As Edward read the final line, his voice broke completely. A tear slid down Isabella's cheek, followed by another. Neither of them spoke for several moments. They didn't need to. Finally, Edward said, barely whispering. He carried my son's watch, and my son carried his words. They both saved something of each other. Isabella nodded, her voice trembling. And together they saved us too. They sat together until the last light faded from the sky. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the only sound in the room. Then, Edward looked at the watch one last time. He smiled faintly, placed it gently on the table and said, I think it's time I let this belong to the world again. Isabella looked at him, understanding. Are you sure? Yes, he said. I've spent so long holding on to the past, but maybe the real way to honor them is to start living again. He stood, a quiet strength in his movements, and placed the watch in her hands. You keep it. You'll know what to do with it. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, Thank you, Edward. As he turned to leave, the chime above the boutique door rang softly, like a gentle note of closure. Weeks passed. Isabella restored the watch and placed it in a glass case in her shop, not for sale, but for remembrance. A small plaque beneath it read, Time never truly ends. It only changes hands. People often asked her about the story behind the watch. She would smile softly and say, It belonged to two men who taught me that forgiveness can mend what time cannot. And when the cafe next door filled with morning light once again, Isabella would sit by the window, watching the world move forward, a quiet peace finally settling in her heart. Because she knew now, love and loss were never opposites. They were just two sides of the same clock, ticking toward understanding. If you liked my story, please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more video